Welcome back. Welcome to the When Wellbeing Becomes a Team Sport podcast. I'm Kristen Lessig-Schenerlein, excited to be with you today. Well, today we're going to get started with this idea of co-creation. So when we go from good intentions to shared agreements in our workplaces, so how co-care becomes real. Well, I'd start by saying most of the leaders that I work with, they genuinely care about their team members. I would say that wholeheartedly. They want their teams to be well. They want their teams to feel good about their work. They want their team members to succeed. And yet, in the conversations that I have with team members, they're still on a path to burnout. So what's happening? Why is that? So I see this tension, right? Leaders, we care. We want our employees to be happy. We want to have a positive work environment that they come to every day. But team members are still feeling stretched, really thin. And we might have intentions to practice well-being in the workplace, but we're not necessarily seeing the outcomes of that maybe as quickly as we need to in this whitewater world of work. So this idea of care in the workplace doesn't fail because people don't mean it. It fails because it isn't designed into the system, right? It's just kind of a hope or a dream. And all those are good, a wish, right? But we have to work at it. So well-being lives in our systems. It's not just a statement that we make, right? We've all kind of seen or heard about like the vision statement or the values being something that's just posted up on the wall, but we don't live it into practice in our day-to-day actions and behaviors. And so I think that systems lens is really important when we think about what care looks like, what caring for our team members' well-being looks like. So workplaces are systems, whether they are hybrid systems, they're all remote systems, or they're in-person physical work environment systems. And they're made from the norms that we set, the group norms that we set, the expectations. Think about it as simply as when we come into a conference room, do we carry in our phones and our laptops and immediately log in, or are all of those technological devices set aside and we're fully there, present and connected to the people around that table for that time that we have with them around whatever agenda has been set? Those become routines. There's an expectation that is set about what it looks like to come into that team meeting. And there's power in that will ripple into how we show up for each other. People adapt to unhealthy systems just as well as they adapt to healthy systems. So that's where we really think about, as leaders, how are we setting up the structures and the systems within our companies or organizations. And so there's this model called job, demands, and resources that I found in my research that is extremely simple and easy to apply in your work environments. And when you think about the level of burnout, if you listen to the last episode, I didn't necessarily share any stats, but I can say that, stress, right? Not the healthy stress that comes from like, hey, I've got this really exciting presentation that's coming up, and I'm kind of motivated by a good amount of stress to get that accomplished, get that achieved, get that ready for review with my team, whatever that may be. But the stress that lasts and lingers for a long period of time, that chronic stress, is what leads to burnout. And 77% of people report feeling that level of stress at work on a regular basis. So that's pretty high. That's over 3/4 of people leave work feeling that level of stress. And so if this idea of burnout is a real, true challenge for many of us in a leadership position, we have to look at what are the job demands resources using this model that impact that. So burnout happens when demands far exceed the resources that any team member perceives that they have to do their job. So demands are high and resources are low. Now, perceived resources. It could be that they don't realize the resources that they have, or they're not tapping into the resources that may exist, or they might not actually be there, right? All of those things can be true. But it's not because people aren't resilient enough. Sometimes that's what I hear, right? Is like, well, they're just, they just got to be able to grit it out and be stronger. And we don't want our motivation to come from a negative place. So we want to really look at the job demands and resource, that balance between the two. And we also want to look at kind of a foundational model for well-being and how that applies to each team member. So foundational model, Dr. Martin Seligman developed the PERMA model. And this is why, I believe it's great. I integrate it into all of my work, but it's not enough alone, right? So it really is impactful when it is paired with that job demands resource model, because it tells us how people are doing, but it doesn't tell us why people feel the way that they feel or what to change how they feel showing up on Monday morning. So this is where we want to pivot and shift to integrating well-being a little bit differently from outcome-driven, from individual to shared, right? So from just what are the outputs and the outcomes to what drives that well-being, and how do we make it just not just an individual pursuit, but a shared effort, that team sport. So this starts with co-creation. This is maybe the missing move, right? So co-creation is shared design, shared voice, shared responsibility. In coaching, we co-create an environment with our clients. What is it that they would like to get out of the experience? What are they bringing in? How do we come to an agreement about what this relationship looks like? Well-being in the workplace, when we think about that through the lens of co-creation, it improves when people, every person has a voice, has a sense of personal agency, that self-efficacy, and can I help identify what are the conditions that would support them in shaping how they approach their work. So not just something that we have to decide and figure out as leaders, but that we integrate into how we're approaching this with those that we are leading. So co-creation isn't consensus, right? It's participation. It's involving people in the process. The key to this, though, comes to a really important foundational concept in psychology that many of you may have heard of, which is psychological safety. So Dr. Amy Edmondson from Harvard's research really delves into this. This began actually at Google. They were researching what was it that set high-performing teams apart from other teams, and they called it Project Aristotle. And what they found was the presence of psychological safety. And how that's defined by Dr. Amy Edmondson is our ability to take interpersonal risk. So, well, what does that mean? Well, my ability to raise my hand in a meeting and to voice dissent, concern for an approach, or to offer in a different alternative option to be considered without fear that that's going to negatively impact us in the form of retaliation or negative consequences. So each member of our team needs to feel like they can speak honestly, that they can ask for what they need in the way of maybe special considerations around what well-being practices would support their high performance. And the ability to ask, like, if this isn't working, can they voice that without penalty? So the key here is that psychological safety is not about feeling safe, right? Or comfortable even, because there is discomfort in having to raise your hand to say that you don't understand something or that you need some support. That is not going to be an easy thing to do, to practice. So the presence of psychological safety, the environment, is really important. And when I work with teams, we define it together because everybody defines it differently. And we actually root into three key elements of psychological safety, which are active listening, respect, and open-mindedness. What does that look like in your work environments? How does your team define those? And can we use them almost to create like a little bubble of understanding around how each meeting, how each interaction within the team should look, right? If we are practicing active listening, if we are remaining open-minded, and if we are showing each other respect in the way that we've defined it, we have a solid foundation for psychological safety. And once we have that, then we really lean into this co-creation and the agreements. So in my research around co-creation, I developed an interest into what's called ideals in organizational psychology, and these are kind of contracts or agreements between an individual and the company or organization. It allows us to look at kind of personalized flexibility, aligning what the needs may be with the shared goals. And it allows us to be really transparent in what we're asking for and what we need in order to complete our jobs and our work to the high level of performance that may be expected. They're not about special treatment, though. They're about smart alignment. So when you create these ideals, they're really about smart alignment, really being thoughtful in our approach. So I've taken this and I've created co-care agreements that I encourage each of the organizations that I work with to embed into their HR practices. Maybe it's quarterly or annual or biannually performance reviews, having these be something that are taken out, discussed with, looked at, and serve as a bit of a dynamic working document for each team member. This is where well-being gets to be really real, practical. They're co-created agreements, right? So again, what I may need as an individual may not be something that the organization can offer me. That's a foundation of these ideals, right? Is that there has to be a bit of a negotiation. And it's visible, it's shared. I encourage team members to review each other so that we know and can support what each individual has prioritized for their well-being that supports them in their long-term goals within the organization. They are reviewed. It gives a level of mutual accountability to what has been discussed. And this is how we move that care that a leader has, that we know a leader has, into not just something we say in a statement, but a real intentional action that becomes part of our organization's infrastructure. So well-being doesn't scale through more apps, these one-off wellness programs or retreats. It scales through better agreements. And that can be as simply as I'm going to block my calendar from 12 to 1 o'clock every day to take lunch away from my computer. It's not going to be a problem for the organization. Maybe, maybe not, right? But that's a conversation with your leader. Or one day a month, I want to volunteer at my kids' school. That will fuel me energetically in my work if I know as a working mom that I also can commit to volunteering at my son's school once a month. And so that might mean that I come in at 9:30 versus 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. Can that work within the systems and structure of our company? Those are the types of things. Maybe it's also, you know what? the demands of my job are really high right now, and I feel like I need a resource to support me. Now, I feel like I might need weekly meetings with you as my leader. 20, 30 minutes. I'll come with an agenda, but I just feel like I need that connection point. That's a resource that will leverage and support the demands that are put on that person to do their job. I mean, maybe it's a conference they want to attend, and that might be a financial investment for the organization, something you can or cannot do right now that has to be considered. But meeting with you for 20 to 30 minutes, there's no cost, right? Is there a cost to taking a lunch break? Is there a cost to coming in late one day a month for them to volunteer at their son's school? I would say the cost far outweighs the reward in an employee that feels like they have the practices in place to support them and resource them to achieve the long-term goals of the organization. So if we're saying that well-being scales through better agreements and co-created agreements, I want you to reflect on for yourself as individuals, regardless of your title or position, where are their needs being held silently? Maybe there's unspoken needs that you have that you haven't shared with your leader, or just with yourself that you haven't attuned to as the leader of a company. You could be CEO. You don't have to answer to anyone, but maybe there are things that you are not doing for yourself that you could model for your team. What could be named and shared within your team? How could you talk about this and normalize walking away from your computer and taking a lunch from 12 to 1? What would it look like to design this idea of care, of well-being practices together within your team? Is it an upcoming team meeting where you surface this opportunity? We want to think about making this care that we have, and I know you all have for your teams, as something that you intentionally practice and showcase through potentially co-care agreements, where we are adapting to and addressing the high degree of burnout that we know that exists, the stress levels 3/4 of people report on any given day, and that we are proactively and strategically approaching well-being, so that we're not just talking about it, but we're encouraging it, and we're making it part of our everyday, and we're investing in it from a time perspective, not an initiative or an add-on or coffee bar or a special outside consultant coming in. Not necessarily that, just starting really simple, thinking about getting the flywheel moving a little bit. Thinking about having a conversation with your team about what is it that really fuels us, that will have the greatest impact. How do we hone in on that, our hedgehog concept? We don't want exhaustion and burnout to be a norm, right? We want to normalize how we resource and support the high demands of our work environments today. So the issue isn't effort here. We don't need to work longer, faster, harder, but designing systems that support our well-being. Thank you for joining me for When Wellbeing Becomes a Team Sport. In a world that often asks us to do more, move faster, and carry our heavier loads, the answer isn't simply becoming more resilient as individuals, it's building stronger teams. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to share it with someone in your corner of the world and continue the conversation. I'm Coach Kristen, creator of the Co-Care Framework. Until next time, keep looking for ways to move from self-care to co-care, because when well-being becomes a team sport, we all have a better chance of crossing the finish line. Be well, stay connected, and keep making waves. See you next time.